Hello. In the next couple of minutes, I would like to talk to you about apps and especially the hosting parts of apps. So how you can host the backend for your app when it's necessary, what are the best options there. So just a small deep dive and giving you some more background information. So first about who am I? My name is Jens Küper. I work for Shopware for a bit over 4 years now. Started as a developer core and working on Shopware 5, and then from the very early days of Shopware 6, when we didn't even have a name for it, I started working at the core and building the foundation. And later on, after Shopware 6 was released, I started working as a cloud engineer, working on Shopware Cloud. So I have experience in both topics, like the development of Shopware and how to develop plugins and apps for Shopware 5 and 6, but also how to do all the infrastructure, how to host it, what works best. And I would give you some insights in the next minutes. So hosting an app is not always required. It is required if you want to embed an iframe in the Shopware 6 administration. Then you have to host the code somewhere. And it's also required if you want to have some custom actions in the administration, like for example in the order module you want to have a button that creates a DHL shipping label or something like that. Then you need a backend for that which can process these actions. It's also required if you want to subscribe to webhooks. So in the app system we allow to subscribe to various webhooks. For example, if an entity changes, like product or order, or if an entity is created or deleted, you can subscribe to that action to do some logic or to fetch even more information. And then you definitely need some sort of hosting because your backend, which does process this logic, has to run somewhere. It's also required if you want to do payment processing via an app, but there are also cases where it's not required. So if you just want to change the looks and styles of Shopware via themes or template edition, you can do so. You can bundle it as an app. You can use the theme JSON in the same way you would do in a plugin. Or you can extend the trick templates the same way you would do it in a plugin, and then no hosting is required, no backend is required. That's the simplest way, basically. One note here is that template editions only work for the storefront. There you can extend, override basically every template, but for the administration that's not possible. If you want to extend the administration, you have to do this via an iframe or via the custom actions. And often people think that apps are not that beneficial because they tend to be recognized as less powerful than plugins, which in some ways they are, but in a lot of ways they are not. So one huge benefit you have with an app is you have the control over the back end, which means you have a free choice of your programming language. You're not limited to PHP. You can choose every language out there. So you could go with Go, do a Node.js app. Of course, you can still use PHP, but also other languages are possible. There's really no limitation as long as you can establish HTTP communication with the shop. You are free in the choice of your framework. so you can still use Symfony. But even there, if you want to use Symfony, you don't have to stick to the Symfony version Shopware uses. So for example, you could use the very latest Symfony release, and you can change the configuration. So there are a lot of things which are in Symfony which Shopware does not use for various reasons, like doctrine, and you can do all that for your backend. So you can say, well, I want to use Symfony 5 and I want to use doctrine and I want to use auto wiring, all that stuff, because it's your choice and your configuration. But of course, if you go with another programming language, you could also use Ruby on Rails, for example. You can use Django, you can use Express. Yeah, there's no limitation. And of course, you can stick to PHP and use a different framework, for example. You have a free choice of your compute power, basically. So you could use a dedicated server. You can, in theory, host that server at your home on a Raspberry Pi. Probably not the best idea in terms of availability and stuff, but in theory that's possible. You can go serverless, so you don't have to handle any hardware at all, which can be beneficial in a lot of cases. You are free in the choice of data store. So of course you can stick to a MySQL database, but you can also use a different database engine like Postgres, NoDB, MongoDB, whatever you like, and whatever your project or your requirements fits best, because it always depends on the use case. What kind of data do you have to store? How often do you have to access them? What kind of operations you have to do or you have to perform on that data? Yeah, so there's that. And one major factor which I see as a huge benefit is you can easily add additional services. So you are not limited to just a programming language and some sort of compute power, but there are powerful services out there which can be easily used via an API or an SDK. So for example, you could use machine learning. You can train your own model and connect that to your backend and offer services that wouldn't be possible as a plugin, because you have to have all the data centralized and you have to use special compute power, because when you write a plugin, you are basically limited to the compute power on the actual server the client is running. And if you want to use machine learning, there's special hardware for that, and that's not usually available on the normal web server. So that's a big plus. You have the possibility to combine data, because in a way where you use a plugin, you have the plugin distributed across all the systems. So on every customer server, on every shop, there's a new instance running of that plugin, but that also means the data is not central in one point, but it's distributed across all your installations. And if you use an app and you use one backend, you can use one database and store data in there and enhance the customer experience by that. So you could say one customer, well, why don't you try out this and that, because gathering the data beforehand from other customers, it works well to do it in a different way. Yeah, and that's really a big plus. You have also the control over the update process, because with a plugin you can release an update and it's shown to the shop owner, but he has to install it. And from our experience, over time you have a very large distribution of versions basically. So there are customers running a version 1 or 2 years old, and there are also customers which have updated like 5 minutes ago. But you have to maintain all these versions. You have to wait for the majority of the customers to be on a certain version before you can deprecate something. And that's different if you have the control over the update process. So if you, for example, have a styling error or a critical bugs in your app backend, you can fix it, and the fix will be immediately there for every customer. They don't have to do anything, which is I think amazing, and it's more the way you do software deployments in 2021. And one thing we also found over time is when you do an app, you can add central error logging and monitoring, so you can log all the errors which occur on the server side on your backend, and become aware of bugs or issues faster than you normally would when you just writing a plugin and have to wait until the customer informs you about a problem. Then you have to debug it, find the error, release an update, and then we are at the point before it takes a while until the update is installed by every shop owner. So what are your options for hosting then? You can go kind of the old school way, buy a dedicated server, install operating system, install a web server, install, for example, PHP or npm or something like that, and run it there, which works just fine. You have certain problems there, which I will show you later on. You could go with an infrastructure as a service provider. There are lots of big players out there like AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Office Azure. So a lot of big names there, which all have excellent service. And one advantage here is they all have a free tier. So what that means is, like, it's not the same for every infrastructure as a service provider, but they usually offer you that if you don't exceed a certain quota of resources, of requests, of operations, like it depends on the service, then you don't have to pay anything. And I can only really speak from experience for AWS, but the free quotas there are pretty big, so you can really host an app with not just a few users there without paying anything, which I think is a huge benefit because it lets you start easily. You don't have to worry about costs. You can start building your app and your infrastructure at the same time. And if your app over time really becomes very big, of course you leave the free tier eventually, but then you are already earning money, so that shouldn't be an issue. And last but not least, you have the option to use a platform as a service provider like platform.sh or Heroku, or there are also different ones, and they do a bit more than the infrastructure as a service provider. So when you go with infrastructure as a service, you get the infrastructure, they manage the hardware, they manage often the operating system, so they give you certain choice of operating systems, and that's basically it. So they ensure the hardware is running, and you have to ensure the software is running and update the software from time to time. With platform as a service, you have to worry about even less. So you just choose like an instance size which fits your need, and they will handle the operating system, but they will also handle things like installing PHP, installing Redis, updating these, so you don't have to deal with that. And there's even another option called serverless. So when you go serverless, it means there are no dedicated compute resources anymore. So you there's no server running 24/7 with your code on it. It's basically the other way around. You just upload your code, and every time it needs to be executed, for example, because a request comes in or it's triggered by something, then it's executed on a very large cluster of compute resources, and you are built in milliseconds of execution time. And the great advantage here is you have autoscaling built in, so it doesn't matter if your function is executed once per month or like 10,000 times in 1 second. The infrastructure provider can handle that. There's absolutely no maintenance of infrastructure, of updating things, which is also a huge benefit. And there are some useful resources for serverless. I found a great framework called Serverless, which is available open source on GitHub, has over 40,000 stars already, and it allows you to deploy your code to all the big infrastructure provider out there. So there's no vendor lock-in. You can switch whenever you like. It supports all of the big programming languages out there, and helps you to manage the life cycle of your serverless architecture, because of course from time to time you want to ship a new version, so you have to do a build process, you have to deploy, you have to update, you have to delete it, and there's also an optimization included for continuous integration and continuous deployment. And to give you an idea, we looked at pricing and different options and came up with an example, because it's always something new. When you go with the plugin route, you don't have to worry about pricing at all, because the customer fully pays for the compute cost. So if your plugin consumes resources, it doesn't really matter for you as a plugin manufacturer. For apps that's different, but on the other hand, for app you also have a monthly income of revenue, so shouldn't be a problem. But let's say we have a PHP backend hosted on platform.sh. The app brings in $5 per month, in your bank account, and we have 50 users, so that's $250 per month you basically earn. And the standard plan on platform SH costs $50, and basically one CPU is included, and a little bit less than 1 GB of RAM. And we looked at the latest Symfony 5 benchmarks. They have benchmark for a REST API on a much beefier machine, and they were able to do 3,000 requests per second with that machine. We scaled these numbers down to the platform SH machine, which would result in 50 to 100 requests per second that your application backend could handle. Of course, these numbers vary a lot, really depending on what programming language do you use, how efficient do you program, what kind of compute task you are doing. So yeah, it really depends. It's just an example to give you an idea. And let's say you have one request per installed app per second, which is a lot because a lot of apps will be like inactive. Yeah, that would mean like 50 requests per second because you have 50 users, which is totally fine according to the benchmark. And so with the standard plan and an app that brings in $5 per month, you would earn around $200 profit and still be able to host your app and serve all your customers. And next up are deployables. So what are the options to actually deploy your app? One thing we learned over the time are that there are a lot of benefits when doing immutable deployments. So first up is the scaling is much easier because you have built your application, for example, into a container, which is immutable, and then you can start multiple server or multiple compute resources running that container, which allows you to scale up and down easily. You can do blue-green deployments, so deploy a new app version and do a traffic shift from the old version to the new version if everything works fine. When going with containers, you can pin all the dependencies, so the PHP version, all the PHP extensions, operating system libraries, all that stuff, and you have free choice of infrastructure. So containers basically work everywhere, no matter what way you choose. And last but not least, with serverless, there's a huge benefit that you have no maintenance of the operating system, any libraries, any extensions. You don't have to worry about it. Auto scaling is super easy. They will completely do it for you, and you only pay for what you really need. So if there's a server, so there's no server idling 24/7 and costing you money. And some best practices we learned over the time is it's better to deploy smaller changes but more frequently. First obvious benefit is you ship the value sooner to the user. So we're not waiting to build a full release every couple of months. You can fix bug fixes or small feature improvements like every week. And the deployments are less risky because you have a smaller change set. So if something breaks, you know faster what went wrong because there are not like 200 things you change and you have to find out what caused the problem. Which overall leads to more stability, and you are also more trained in that process. Like if you do it every couple of months, it's always like something new because you forgot how to do it a bit. And if you do it every week, you don't have that problem. And another benefit, which also comes with the app system and having your own backend, is to gather insights from real life usage. So first up is logging, see what errors occur, what are people actually doing, because then you can also decide where you put your resources in terms of development. So if you see, well, my app can basically do two things, but one thing isn't really used by the users, then you can focus on that part that is heavily used. Also, monitoring is great to see if something went wrong or an unexpected behavior occurs, or for example, you see that after the latest deployment, your app needs a lot of a lot more of CPU resources, you can look into it and see what have changed. Maybe you changed your source code, maybe a dependency change which is now consuming more resources. You can also do usage metrics to see if your calculation in the beginning, like how big of an instance you need, really is correct, or if you maybe have to scale down or scale up. Then look into apps and services. First up is your app doesn't have to have its own backend, and it's not limited to one service. So what do I mean by that? For example, if you are already a company with a software product yourself, let's say you offer to print shipping labels because you're a shipping company or you integrate with one, then you don't have to write a complete new backend. You just have to write some sort of bridge or glue code to connect the Shopware shop to your existing backends and your existing APIs. And of course, you can combine multiple services. So you can talk with multiple APIs and extend the value for the customer. So a common use case how that could look is you already have a web service and you want to integrate that to Shopware via an app. Then you can do a sidecar deployment. So there's your code already running, for example, in a container, and you can spawn a second container which hosts just a very small code base, which allows the Shopware app to connect to you, or the Shopware app system, and then talks to your primary REST API or service. And and by doing so, your app will be tightly coupled to your web service. So if you deploy a new version of your web service, you can also deploy a new version of the app. Yeah, that's great. And of course, you can also share, if you plan to develop multiple apps, you can share common services between multiple apps. So you could basically, it depends on how you want to do it. You can do it either on a code level, so you include certain parts in multiple projects, but you could also do it on a service level, like your app for shipping labels talk to the common service which hosts, like, I don't know, user data or order data, and then there's another service doing voucher codes that could use the central shared common service as well. So that was it from my side. I hope you learned a bit, and hope to talk to you in the future about apps, about DevOps.